BookTube, it's Amy. So I don't have any new books in the mail today. I haven't gotten mail of any kind through Canada Post in 3 days. Nothing since Monday. I've heard that they've been experiencing very high volumes of mail. They describe them as Christmas-like volumes. So the sort of volumes they would have around the holidays. Just, I guess, with people ordering so much stuff online. So I will have to wait for my book purchases, which I assume are stuck at processing centers all along the borders. I had a number of books coming from bookshops in the States and a number of books coming from bookshops in the United Kingdom. So we shall see when those will arrive. There are 3 or 4 books that I had ordered in early March, and the delivery date, they were supposed to be delivered by April 25th. So we'll see whether those show up. One of them was a trollop novel that I guess a couple people here on BookTube were planning to read together in April, starting the beginning of April. And I guess it's good that I bowed out on that and said no, because I didn't think my copy would arrive in time, and it didn't. As well as just a couple of other really cheap books that I paid $1 or $2 for. One of them was a little book by Maupassant, and I forget what the other one was, but they were just, little cheap things I ordered at the beginning of March for some extra reading, waiting on those. And then of course there are some more books about books that I've ordered, and the biography of Hugh Thompson that I'm waiting on, and one more J.M. Barrie that I ordered. So we'll see when that stuff arrives. But for now, I'm still working my way through the memoirs of a Bookman by James Milne. And I thought I would read a little bit of a chapter here. I'm not sure I'll do the whole chapter, but I'll read a little bit. I'm going to apologize in advance if I trip over my tongue. As I said last time, Milne has winding sentences with many, many commas. He was not a very concise writer. And at the start of each chapter, he sort of gives a summary of what is covered. And so this is called Hardy by the Suffolk Sea, a leisurely and colorful conversation piece with Thomas Hardy as the natural, simple, russet-aired countryman of Wessex, in contradistinction to the great English author who is also in these Noctes Ambrosian. So he writes here on page 125, approach a mountain range and you have difficulty in making out which are really the highest peaks, but look back on it and they are manifest. This parable may be found in the moderate heights of the Scottish Grampians, in the great European heights of the Alps, or in the giant peaks of the Indian Himalayas. At least that is the experience of one who, being Victorian, Edwardian, and Georgian, has a long retrospect and a lively interest in the prospect. Surely Thomas Hardy is the English author whose writings, in their spirit and style, have bridged and linked those 3 reigns, anyhow, in his novels. He lit bonfires on the skyline of the past and the present, warnings that the old dam of the Victorians was bursting through. But in its tumult, it was bearing new soil for the near Edwardians and the farther Georgians, and their whole duty was to be up and sowing. We all have our favorite authors, chosen in youth, generally when the sympathies are quick and warm, intuitive rather than critical. Stevenson was a first hero of mine for his Treasure Island, and the writing of it in a little house, which I have seen 100 times, at Castletown of Braemar in the Aberdeenshire Highlands. He was there one autumn with his American wife, to whom he was to owe so much care and inspiration, and her 2 children, afterwards familiar in his life as Mrs. Strong and Mr. Lloyd Osborne. An eventual meeting with Mr. Osborne gave the assurance that he must have been a delightful boy, but the Braemar weather was imprisoning, and RLS had to carry on his literary work. So, if the small folk would be very good, he would write a fine yarn and read it to them in the lamplight of the evening. And that was the origin of Treasure Island. After Stevenson, Thomas Hardy, more deeply romantic because more gauntly realistic, and thus acquaintance with him when it came in the goodness of London life was a personal page, completing many read pages. One particular meeting with somebody is often the richest impression of that person, and indeed thus struck, you may have made a record of it at the time. This takes me to a weekend when the 20th century was young at Edward Claude's Suffolk home, Stratford House, in Alderburgh town. So just an example, that sentence I just read had 1, 2, 3, 4 commas in it. And, I'm looking at these sentences and I'm rereading some of them, and they're not proper sentences. They're many sentences strung together with commas. They're what I think we would call a run-on sentence. And yet here they are. He's got the clumsiest writing style, and it's just really awkward to read. And his sentences, you don't know where they're going when you start them. So forgive me if this reading isn't the best. But it's interesting subject matter, but perhaps not written in an accessible style. But anyway, he says, this takes me to a weekend when the 20th century was young at Edward Claude's Suffolk home, Stratford House, in Alderburgh town. It might be said that he had a salon there, for his stream of guests included many eminent writers and thinkers, always sure of a mutual feast of reason and flow of soul. As one of them, Thomas Hardy would come up to London and travel to East Anglia, though he did not readily leave his house at Dorchester. No railway station in London gives you a more gloomy send-off to the country than Liverpool Street, moated in the grey borderline of the city and the East End. On the other hand, its foggy, smoky atmosphere is a stimulus to one's relish of a clearer sky and a purer air in the awaiting Essex and Suffolk. No doubt, here was the twofold feeling of a little party that, on an afternoon in late October, found its way to the Alderburgh-bound train which Edward Claude had named, and in which, always sweetly thoughtful, he had already found seats. We travelled third, of course, and therefore had the full fun of a railway journey, including the tight squeeze in an overcrowded compartment. This in no way disturbed Thomas Hardy, who sat in a corner seat, quiet as usual, often detached, except for the formalities of meeting, until we were free of London. By then we got talking, and now he would join in. And again he would cast his countryman's swift eye out on the countryside as it swam by. It is a sign in which you can recognize the man nurtured on and amid wide spaces, and the townsman who lives close to things. Hardy, I find the aid to memory telling me, looked older than when I had last seen him, and, in the kindly Scottish phrase, he was getting little book kit, that is, smaller in physique. He was balder, for one thing, almost completely bald, and he happened to say that once he had a great crop of hair. He thought that perhaps the wearing of a tall hat, as was fashionable when he was a young architect in London, had been the first cause of its loss. Now he wore a soft felt hat, which had once been green, but had, thanks to the sun, shower, and honest service, become a medley of colours. His clothes were a heavy top coat of a black and white check, and a tweed suit of no particular shade, though it was russet, and also of no particular cut. He had never been a dressy man, everything nondescript and modest, even to his Gladstone bag of brown leather, grown darkish and tagged Hardy Passenger, a detail that but eloquent of the novelist's simple ways and shrinkage from the eye of the world. Not for him the label which would invite the remarks, "That's Thomas Hardy, the great author." At some station in our journey through East Anglia, a servant girl, looking plump, jumped in among us, first asking, "Is this first class?" "No," she was assured, probably by Hardy himself, he being next door. "It's third." Sure she was in the right place, and shyly recovering from her fluster, she sat down in the seat we made for her by a little extra squeezing. Presently, as if she felt she must explain herself, she said she could not read, that she was going to such and such a station, and would the train stop there. Hardy was instantly concerned with the circumstance that she could not read, and asked her sympathetically, almost earnestly, "Why is that?" She shook her head, saying she did not know, just she had not learned, and she was 18 years old. She could, however, say the letters of the alphabet backwards, say them better thus than forwards, and didn't this, her voice seemed to suggest, make up a little for her unableness to read? Here, I remember thinking, was another possible Tess or Sue, a rustic heroine ready-made for a Wessex novel, but by then Hardy had stopped writing fiction. Why? Perhaps there was a side light for us on that in a casual remark he made about his Jude the Obscure. I have, he said, seen acquaintances turn away when I met them. You get accustomed even to that, but it is not pleasant. If he had gone on writing other novels, would they have been Jude's, more so or less so? Hardy did not say, but he did inferentially speak of the progress which English fiction, in its examination of human life, had made in the years following Jude and Tess. Probably he was thinking of them as blazers of the trail which led to the emancipation of the English novel from its long Victorian shackles. His inexpressiveness about himself did not let this appear, but one learned to attach as much to his silences as to his words. Even his measured way of talking had its different significances when you got to understand them. Jude, I had been told, was a book on which Hardy set personal store, though, when it appeared, it had not nearly the popular success of Tess, and still more criticism from the Victorian paladins of literary virtue. Remembering this, I asked him if he had a particular favourite among his novels. He answered generally, by analogy, as he often did, that at one time an author might like one of his own books best, and at another time another of those books, a matter of mood. I suggested that perhaps a writer was apt to lay most value on the book which had cost him most mental labour, wrongly, because the perfect thing is often born, not made. He agreed, and doing so left me with the feeling that he favoured Jude among his stories. How, I inquired, in the course of all this all-round and roundabout conversation, had the reviewing of his books affected him as a writer? Encouraged him, helped him, or discouraged him, kept him back on his very individual Wessex road? Well, he said, for long any praise I got was given grudgingly, and even when it became the habit to praise what I wrote, it was still grudgingly done. About Tess, as you know, I was abused by some papers in unmeasured terms, as if I had done something dreadful. It was, as you also know, still worse with Jude, and the criticism of my verse has sometimes been carping, because on small points, a word or such like. He did not complain or blame, and indeed was grateful for much, and to many, but he just made this note on his passage through the sea of criticism and renown. Somebody, Hardy casually told us, had wanted to summarize several of his novels for a serial work, and he had not countenanced the idea. He enlarged on that refusal by saying it was an impossible idea, and asking what sort of thing would be the result. He illustrated his attitude in the remark that the introduction to Scott's Kilnworth, How the Traveller Came to His Inn, set the whole tune of the story. One of the best pieces of writing Scott ever did, added Hardy. But if there were to be a condensed edition of Kenilworth, I suppose it would instantly be left out. Thus and thus we made the journey to Aldburg, and, arriving there, either took the general bus to Edward Clodd's Stratford house, or walked there with him. He liked the walk between the station and his home, he liked the walk between the station and his home, and as his quick, square figure, begotten of stout seafaring stock, moved along, he would talk of Aldburg, its health qualities, and its associations. He knew the town as intimately as Thomas Hardy knew Wessex, its people and their ways, their soft Suffolk drawl, the picturesque, stimulating landscape behind it, and the changing seascape in front of it. His heart had a warm corner for George Crabbe's old church on the heights above the town, because though he was a rationalist of the Victorian school of Darwin and Huxley, Herbert Spencer and John Morley, he had an innate reverence towards everything noble and of good report. Edward Clodd's hospitality was as simple as it was perfect, for while he thought of his guests all the time, he let them be at home in their own fashion. Outside, on the October occasion which I have been recalling, the wind was lashing coldly in from the North Sea, and the night was deepening into darkness. I'm just going to pause here to show you the photograph here. We have Thomas Hardy and Edward Clodd This is a photograph snapped on the seashore at Aldburg, where the Wessex novelist who is on the right often visited the banker author at his hospitable home in the East Anglian town. And James Milne here is just addicted to commas. I swear every sentence has like 4 or 5 commas, and they're in the oddest places. The waves broke on the shingle from the heavy beat which comes from deep water, because Aldburg has real salt-tanged ocean, just as it keeps its ancient long-shore atmosphere of rope and tar. Here was a community which for centuries has gone down to the sea in ships and boats, and that imprint, A1 at Lloyd's, was on Edward Clodd. Nay, it was the basis of his long-prized work as the secretary of a great London bank, and of his undoubted high service to English thought in letters and science. Within, his Stratford house was all physical warmth and mental light, and surely a guest can seek and get no better hospitality. There was a fire in the old-fashioned hall, and it burned so brightly that you could read the famous names inscribed on a table there which had been presented to Claude on a birthday. Your room, whichever it might be, took you up an easy winding stair, and it offered the welcome of quietude and a bouquet of bedside books. Down again, by and by, to a kindly dining room, a kindly dinner, a bottle of red wine, which the host himself had put in the fireplace to warm, and above all, much serious and careless chat. An incident of the dinner would be the appearance of a stone jar in which a New Englander, grateful for hospitality by Edward Clodd, had sent him from Boston a liquor called Elder Didson. The contrast between its robust flavor and its puritanic name always brought a sparkle into Claude's eyes and jocularity into his comments as he poured it out. The New England pilgrims, grim fellows of a grim religion, yes, but here was Elder Didson, not only the inventor of a comforting spirit, but, since his name christened it, the voucher for it to others. Grave and gay and gay and grave, and each mood so natural that they made a memorable blend of Noctes Ambrosian, for Christopher North and his croonies would not have been better than Stratford House at its best. This was over a cup of coffee, and afterwards in the bow-windowed room on the first floor, which was Edward Clodd's parlour, steady and familiar haunt. It was the centre of the life of Stratford House, and was peopled with photographs, manuscripts, rare and valued books, and it lay on to the bay of Aldburg. There, quiet as a millpool, leaping into small white crests or grumbling in anger, was ancient Mother Sea, and Claude loved her company. Hardy was too much the countryman to be the seaman, but I recollect thinking that the drub of the tide below Claude's window might well have suggested the eerie touch in his Dead Man's Bay of the Dynasts, but of course he got it from his own Wessex coast beside Weymouth, which the King George of the period was in the habit of visiting. Anyhow, that point of history did not arise in the rest of the weekend communings, though these were many and various. Never in the case of Hardy, intimate because he had none of the amiable vanity which opens that door in human nature, or he self-consciously suppressed it. The names of Robert Louis Stevenson and Anthony Trollope cropped up in what conjunction I don't remember, for the two personalities are not easy to join. Hardy spoke of Stevenson, having written some piece of work 13 times, and commented, "I sometimes wish he had not written things so often." Of Trollope I told him what I had seen in a new George Eliot letter, the man and novelist described as the insusceptible Trollope. He laughed and said the phrase was exactly right, because Trollope, in conversation, just went on, indifferent to the attention and to other people. Amid the going round of jokes and light, but never colourless chat, Hardy told us of a Dorset story of an old man who was dying. His daughter came from far to see him, arrived tired and anxious, and when the doctor led her to his bedside, she fainted. The doctor caught her as she was falling, and from the bed a sepulchral voice cried faintly, "Cut her stays!" Hardy, about then, was revising his Dynasts, and he had brought a set of the proofs with him to Aldburg. He was very careful and precise with his markings on those proofs. and if they still exist, no doubt Mr. Gabriel Wells, the American collector, would be glad to hear of them. Perhaps it was in this relation that the question came up of Meredith giving his gardener man Cole some of his manuscripts, and of these being sold later to the Pierpont Morgan, who gathered so many literary and art treasures from England and the old world generally. Was it these manuscripts, asked Hardy, which Meredith alluded to in his will when he said he had provided for Cole? No, answered Edward Claude, and as a banker friend he knew, Meredith had, in his lifetime, put some stock into his servant's name. He had attached no value to the manuscripts, but in friendly fashion had given them to Cole, who only regarded them as a personal token from his master. It was afterwards, and from others, that he learned of their practical value, for manuscripts were not in his line of knowledge. Hereupon, Hardy mentioned that he himself had been approached by a literary agent with the request, would he sell some of his MSS. No name of the person behind the inquiry was given, but it was probably the same active Pierpont Morgan. The inquirer got no sort of response, as Hardy let us understand without saying so, because that might have seemed self-importance. But what, he asked, is a man to do with his MSS? It would look like vanity and assurance to offer them to the British Museum. Not a bit, quoth Edward Claude, and certainly the manuscripts of the author of the Wessex novels and the Dynasts should be preserved there. This tribute of an old friend silenced Hardy for a moment with, perhaps, a pleasant confusion. But he listened to another suggestion which one of us made. There were certain institutions which, by statute, had each to give a free copy of every book published in this country. The British Museum, Oxford University, Cambridge University, the Advocates' Library of Edinburgh, and Trinity College, Dublin. Why should an eminent English writer, wishful to do the right thing in the right way, not distribute his manuscripts over those national institutions? Still better than the British Museum idea, remarked Edward Claude, while Hardy sat and thought the matter over. He may seriously have done that then, for later he did gift his chief manuscripts to national seats of learning and letters, beginning, I think, with Aberdeen University. His first honorary degree came from that ancient and scholarly seat, and it gave him a lively satisfaction and heralded other honors which he took quietly. I'm almost done here. I might as well finish the chapter. Churches and church music. They drew a word from Hardy on the Sunday at Aldburg, when, walking for the air and exercise, we found ourselves beside the parish church. It means a postscript to a Hardy incident which has not been unrecorded, but the details and directness from him make new light. We heard the echoes of the music within, I find in a notebook, and he listened, saying softly, he had always been fond of church music. It had been familiar to him in his youth, and his affection for it remained. He did not go to church when he was at home, as that might be misunderstood, but elsewhere he often did so. This not alone because of his pleasure in music, but because churches had an architectural interest for him. Some of us put into the literary context of George Crabe's former church when we rumbled past it for the station on our way to London after a fine weekend. Some of us put that into the literary context of George Crabe's former church when we rumbled past it for the station on our way to London after a fine weekend. It was only, however, typical of Edward Claude's parties and of the atmosphere which his own beautiful nature gave him. He had, as a host, not only humor and good humor, but the happy word and the pat story drawn from a wealth of memories and experiences. Take one of an American widow, who so often told her neighbor at dinner of her widowhood that his patience and his susceptibility exhausted, he snorted, "Grass or sod, madame?" On some occasion he was having of Bates the naturalist on the La Plata, who in tribute to their friendship named him his trustee. A chief legacy to the family was a wonderful collection of beetles which Bates had spent his life in making. It was so unique that the problem was what to do with it, how to obtain it for anything like its value. Claude's efforts in his way made a lively narration by him, and somehow the beetles were resolved into a substantial sum of money. I fancy he said £3,000. A moment silent followed the narrative, and when a most dear lady of the company, wishful to be sympathetic and seem attentive, quietly asked, "But on what did you feed the beetles?" Laughter and applause. This delicious interlude led Claude to tell the lady, a favourite of his as the wife of a sincere man friend, of a not unsimilar incident which had also happened at his Aldburg dinner table. Races and their characteristics were being discussed humanly rather than learnedly, and somebody remarked on the swarthy Spanish types to be met in our very English Cornwall. Yes, cooed that learned woman, Miss Jane Harrison, who was of the party. The sailors of the Spanish Armada got ashore there. The salt was fathom deep in Edward Claude's blood, and he was never happier than when he was afloat in his little yacht, the Lotus, on the tidal Ald, with a few chosen companions. He was then the little admiral, indeed, my own fond name for him, and he and his man made a ship-shape crew. There was a Lotus 1 and there was a Lotus 2, and both were intimate in Claude's summer life, until the aging 80s hove in sight with him. Not easy to navigate with the Suffolk Ald, with its twisting shoals and its mud banks, where wild birds swarmed and cried. It was staked to help a yachtsman tack safely on the tide, and Claude at the helm himself would post us to watch the stakes in case, in uncertain light, we missed one and found ourselves aground. Once I did miss one, with the foreseen consequence, and a wait for more water, but the little admiral cheered my remorse with the remark, never mind. Thomas Hardy was before you in the same unseamanlike negligence. Thomas Hardy was before you in the same unseamanlike negligence. That's the sentence. The smile in his soft, grey-blue eyes as he spoke lingers with me, like the morning light on his Aldburg bay, where his noble soul found nurture and his ashes dwell with the living tides. So it's not the best writing in the world. In fact, it's not even good writing. But it is interesting to read his reflections of these weekend parties. And, I have to wonder about the author, about the publication of this book. It seems like he is scratching his memory for anything that could possibly be of interest about the famous authors that he met. And he is just spitting out any memory that he can think of to put into this book of memoirs. So it was interesting to read about Hardy. Definitely difficult to get through, and if you think this is hard for me to read aloud, it's also difficult for me to just read quietly by myself, just because the sentence structure is so atrocious. But anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you didn't mind my reading too much. I stumbled a little bit more than I intended to, but I hope you're all having a lovely Thursday, and I'll be back tomorrow with my Friday reads as usual, I guess, although I haven't read very much in the past week. Not very much that I finished anyhow.